I found my father's diary 3 days after his funeral, and by page 12, I knew my mother had been living a double life for 20 years. Not an affair in the way you're picturing, not some fling, a second family, a second house, a second son. My father knew. He knew for 10 years and he never said a word. And the only reason I know any of this now is because he wrote it all down, page after page, like he was building a case from beyond the grave. And the worst part? The absolute worst part? My mother was on the phone wiring money to that other family during his funeral reception, standing in the kitchen in her black dress, crying real tears for the cameras, while her thumb tapped out a bank transfer like it was second nature. I didn't say anything that day, but I kept the diary. And 49 days later, at his memorial dinner, in front of everyone who ever called her a saint, I read it out loud. My name is Vanessa. I'm the youngest of two, and growing up, I was always the sensitive one. That's the label they gave me anytime I asked a question nobody wanted to answer. My brother Mark is 4 years older, and he's always been the golden child, the one who never rocked the boat, the one who took our mother's side before he even heard the full story. Our mother Denise is 61 years old, and if you met her at church, or at a family barbecue, or literally anywhere in public, you would think she was the most devoted wife in the world. She kept a spotless house. She remembered every anniversary. She organized every holiday down to the napkin folds. And she controlled every single dollar that came in or out of our household, down to the cent. My father, Robert, worked as a machinist for 31 years at the same plant. He was quiet. He wasn't the type of man who raised his voice, or made a scene, or demanded anything for himself. He believed his job was to provide, and hers was to manage. And for most of my life, that arrangement looked like it worked. We weren't rich, but we were told we were comfortable. My mother made sure everyone believed that, especially us. She'd sigh about the mortgage. She'd talk about tight months. She'd tell my dad to pick up overtime shifts because we need to be responsible. And we believed her. Every single one of us believed her, right up until my father got sick, and right up until he died, and right up until I opened a plain black notebook I found in the bottom drawer of his nightstand, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts like he was hiding it from someone. It started with a transfer. That's all it was at first, a bank transfer I saw by accident on my mother's phone, 3 days after we buried my dad. We were still in the after of it all, the casseroles in the fridge phase, the thank you card phase, when everyone's still checking on you but starting to go back to their own lives. I walked into the kitchen to get water and my mother was standing at the counter with her phone, and I saw the screen light up with a confirmation. $4,000. Sent to an account labeled only with initials JT. I didn't recognize the initials. I didn't recognize the bank. And when she saw me looking, she didn't even flinch. She just said, "That's for the caterer, don't worry about it," and slipped her phone into her cardigan pocket like she'd done it 1,000 times before. I remember standing there thinking, that's strange. We already paid the caterer. I helped write that check myself. But grief makes you doubt your own memory. It makes you think, maybe I'm wrong, maybe there was a deposit, maybe I'm just looking for something to be upset about because I don't know what else to do with all this sadness. So I let it go. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself grief was making me paranoid. I went back to my apartment that night and I didn't think about it again for almost 2 weeks until I found the diary. And the $4,000 turned out to be the smallest number in the whole story. The first time I actually asked her about it directly was at Sunday dinner, about 2 weeks after the funeral. I brought it up as gently as I could. I said, "Mom, I saw a transfer to someone with the initials JT. The day of Dad's funeral. Who is that?" And I want you to understand, I asked this in the calmest voice I have ever used in my life. I wasn't accusing her of anything. I genuinely thought maybe it was a distant cousin, or an old family friend, or someone from the church helping with expenses. But the second the letters left my mouth, the temperature in that room changed completely. My mother put her fork down very slowly and said, "I can't believe you're bringing up money right now. Your father is barely in the ground and you're playing detective." And before I could even respond, my brother Mark jumped in. Mark, who wasn't even there, who didn't see the transfer, who had no information at all, and he said, Vanessa, seriously? Mom just lost her husband and you're interrogating her about bank statements. What is wrong with you? I tried to explain that I wasn't interrogating anyone, that I was simply asking a question, but it didn't matter. Within 5 minutes, I had somehow become the villain of the conversation. My mother started crying real tears, the kind she's always been so good at producing on command, and she said, I have given my entire life to this family, and this is the thanks I get. My own daughter treating me like a criminal while I'm grieving. Mark got up and hugged her. My aunt, who happened to be visiting, shot me a look like I had just spit on my father's grave. And I sat there, in silence, feeling like the crazy one, feeling like maybe I really had imagined the whole thing. Feeling that familiar, sinking, gaslit feeling I'd had my entire childhood every single time I questioned my mother about anything. I apologized. I actually apologized to her for asking a simple question about a bank transfer that I watched happen with my own 2 eyes. I drove home that night hating myself for doubting her, and hating myself even more for the small, stubborn part of my brain that refused to fully let it go. 2 weeks later, I was helping clean out my father's side of the closet. My mother said she couldn't bear to do it herself, which, looking back, makes perfect sense now. Because she wasn't avoiding grief, she was avoiding what he might have left behind. That's when I found the notebook, wrapped in one of his old flannel shirts, tucked so far into the back of his nightstand drawer that it had clearly been placed there on purpose, to be found by someone specific, at some specific time. The first entry was dated almost exactly 10 years earlier. My hands were literally shaking by the third page. My father had documented, in his own quiet, careful handwriting, that 10 years ago he discovered my mother had a son, not adopted, not from before their marriage. A son she had with another man, a man named James, that she had been seeing on and off for over 2 decades, going back to before Mark was even born. My father wrote that he found out completely by accident, through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned Denise's boy at a hardware store, assuming my father already knew. He wrote about the fight they had. He wrote about how she begged him not to leave, how she said she'd take her own life if he told anyone, how she promised it was over, how she promised James was out of the picture for good. And my father, God rest him, believed her, or at least, he chose to act like he believed her, because the alternative meant blowing up everything he'd built, everything Mark and I knew as home. But he kept receipts. Literally. Bank statements. Photos. A separate folder of financial records showing that every single tight month, every overtime shift he picked up, every vacation we couldn't afford, every scholarship fund we didn't have for college, all of it had been quietly drained, year after year, into supporting a second household 2 hours away, a house, a car, private school tuition for a boy named Jason who is, and I did the math myself, 22 years old right now. My father wrote one line that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. He wrote, I stayed for my children. I documented everything so that when I am gone, they will finally know the truth I was too afraid to tell them myself. Reading that notebook changed something in me instantly. I stopped being the sensitive one who was imagining things, and I became someone with a folder full of proof. I photographed every single page of that diary before I put it back exactly where I found it. I quietly reached out to a cousin on my father's side who I trusted completely, and she helped me track down public records, and sure enough, there was a Jason T., 22, listed with an address 2 hours from our house. Same last initial as the mysterious JT on that funeral day bank transfer. I didn't confront my mother again. Not yet. I had learned my lesson about confronting her without proof, about how fast she could flip a room against me with a single tear. This time, I was going to wait for the moment when she couldn't spin it, couldn't cry her way out of it, couldn't turn my brother and my aunt and every cousin in that family group chat against me with one performance. I decided I would wait for the one event she could never skip, never control, never dodge: my father's 49-day memorial dinner, the traditional gathering where the entire extended family comes together one final time to honor him. She was hosting it herself, at her house, in front of everyone. And I decided that if she was going to use my father's memory as a stage for her performance one more time, then I was going to use that same stage for the truth. The 3 weeks leading up to that dinner were the longest of my life. I went quiet. I stopped bringing up the transfer. I let my mother believe she had won, that I had backed down, that the sensitive daughter had finally learned her place. I even helped her plan the seating chart for the memorial dinner, which is a detail I still can't quite believe about myself, given what I knew. But there was a reason for that seating chart. Because in going through my father's contacts on his old phone, which my mother hadn't thought to clear out yet, I found a number saved simply as J. And on a hunch, one I am still not entirely proud of, I texted that number from an unknown app pretending to be helping coordinate family memorial arrangements on behalf of the family, and I invited James, the other man, and his son, Jason, to the 49-day dinner, phrasing it just vaguely enough that they would assume they'd been formally invited by the family. I told myself it was for closure. I told myself Jason deserved to know his father, even if that father was my father's marriage falling apart in slow motion for 2 decades. But if I'm honest with myself, some part of me wanted my mother to walk into that dining room and see the one thing she could never explain away sitting at her own table. I printed 3 pages from the diary. I put them in my purse, and I waited for the day. The dinner was held in my mother's dining room. 30-some family members packed around 2 long tables, my father's photo on a small shrine near the head of the table with fresh flowers Mark had picked out. Everything was going according to my mother's script, the toasts, the tears, the stories about what a wonderful husband and provider my father had been. And then the doorbell rang. I watched my mother's face when she opened that door and saw James standing there. A man in his 50s she clearly hadn't seen in years, and behind him, a 22-year-old boy who has my father's exact same jawline, standing there in a suit, holding a bouquet of white lilies, saying he was there for Robert's memorial, like the message said. My mother went white. Actually white, like every ounce of blood left her face at once. She stammered something about a mistake, about wrong addresses, and tried to close the door, but Mark, confused, had already come up behind her asking who this was. And that's when I stood up from the table. I said, "Mom, why don't you tell everyone who this is?" Or should I? The room went completely silent. She turned to me and, for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother have absolutely nothing to say. I pulled out the 3 pages from my father's diary, and in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it was, I read his own words out loud about James, about Jason, about 20 years, about every overtime shift and every scholarship we never had. I looked directly at her and said, "You made Dad work himself into the ground so you could pay for a life he wasn't even allowed to know about. And you cried at his funeral while wiring money to fund it." Jason, standing frozen in the doorway, said quietly, "Wait, Robert knew about me?" And my mother, cornered, in front of every relative who had ever called her a saint, finally said the only true sentence I think I've ever heard leave her mouth. "I never meant for anyone to find out." In the weeks after that dinner, everything unraveled fast. My aunt, who had once looked at me like I was disrespecting my father's memory, was the first one to pack up and leave the family group chat my mother had run for years, and she started a new one without my mother in it. Mark didn't speak to me for almost a month, not because he thought I was lying, but because he couldn't process that our mother, his mother, the woman he'd defended his entire life, had built her whole identity on a lie he never saw coming. Eventually he came around, mostly after he did his own digging and found records confirming everything, down to the tuition payments. As for my mother, it turns out my father was quietly ahead of her the entire time. Buried in that same notebook was a copy of an updated will, filed with a lawyer 8 months before he died, transferring the majority of his retirement accounts and his half of the house directly to Mark and me, specifically excluding any joint assets my mother might try to claim or divert. He never told her. He never told us either, not until his own words explained why. My mother is currently fighting that will in probate court, and losing, badly, because the paper trail he left behind, the same paper trail I read out loud at that dinner table, makes her financial history impossible to explain to a judge. Jason and I have actually talked a few times since then. He's not a villain in any of this. He's just a kid who grew up not knowing his father had another family, the same way I grew up not knowing my mother had one too. My father spent the last decade of his life protecting two families that never even knew about each other. And the only thing he asked of me, in that notebook, was that the truth would come out eventually. I just decided eventually I was going to be at his own memorial dinner. So here's my question for you. Was I wrong to read my father's diary out loud at his own memorial, in front of everyone, on what was supposed to be a night of respect for him? Or did my mother lose the right to a peaceful memorial the moment she chose to protect her secret over my father's memory? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If this story hits you the way I think it will, do me a favor and hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe, because tomorrow, I've got another story for you, this one about a woman who found out her inheritance was never hers to begin with. Trust me, you don't want to miss it.